Next, we would like to invite our first keynote speech. Our first keynote speaker is the Chairperson of GenderBased, Committee Member of CEDAW, Ms. Bandana Rana. 接下来我们要邀请 Bandana Rana 担任第一场专题演讲主持人，谢谢。
Once again, and again I express my delight, happiness and honor to be here. As you know, I have two hats over here, and that is what I am representing. One is I am the chair of the Global Network of Women Shelters, but I am also a member of the CEDAW committee, which was mentioned several times by our Taiwanese official this morning. So it is based on my two hats that I am presenting my keynote address this morning. I have a written address, and I think I should stick to it because I believe it is translated and printed for you. So I don't want to divert too much from it. However, the topic I was given was the provisions in international human rights instruments that refer to shelters. So I am going to be confined or limited to those aspects. So let me start. Once again, I am delighted to be a part of this very important cross-regional dialogue at the Asian Network of Women Shelters Conference on transforming women's shelters. I would like to thank the network for this opportunity. I would particularly like to extend my deep gratitude to Chi Wei-rong, CEO, Garden of Hope, and Chairperson of Asian Network of Women Shelters, the host of this conference. I think she's a symbol of someone who works in a shelter and you require that trait, you know? She's always smiling, calm, composed, no matter what. So I think the leadership that she has is very commendable. Organizing a conference of this scale annually entails a lot of human and financial resources, which is always scarce. But above all, it requires vision and commitment, which the Garden of Hope has so well demonstrated by organizing annual Asian conferences and strengthening the shelter movement in Asia. Now I'm limiting my presentation to certain provisions in several UN documents or human rights documents which refers to shelter. Because many times you might think shelter is never referred, but I would like to pick out those documents where shelter is particularly and specifically referred, so that we are able to use those references in our advocacy for strengthening the shelter movement. The UN General Assembly has called on states to develop mechanisms to ensure a comprehensive, multidisciplinary, coordinated, systematic, and sustained response to violence against women to increase the likelihood of successful apprehension, prosecution of the offender, which will contribute to the well-being and safety of the victims. Shelters should thus be able to provide a range of services in accordance with required standards with respect to the premises, facilities, staff services, and operations, as we all know. International and regional human rights and policy instruments set out states' obligations to combat all forms of discrimination against women and to protect their human rights, including every woman's right to be free from violence. These obligations include the obligation to protect women against gender-based violence, particularly in the context of domestic violence or intimate partner violence, by ensuring their safety and human rights through access to shelters. In my presentation, I would like to share some of the key human rights instruments that have made references and provisions related to shelters in addressing the larger goal of eliminating gender-based violence against women. As you know, as a CEDAW member, I think CEDAW is the most important Bill of Rights for women, which we can use for advocacy and lobbying. So I will highlight more on CEDAW. And I was very happy to hear this morning that Taiwan has domesticated CEDAW. In fact, it has passed a law to implement CEDAW and contributes to the gender equality policies, which is so commendable. So, I mean, lovely. We can learn a lot from Taiwan. You know? So CEDAW, which is there anyone, I'm sorry for being a little bit interactive, and I'm not trying to defame anyone because it's okay. Everyone does not need to know UN documents, you know. Is there anyone in this room who doesn't know what CEDAW is? Is this the first time you have heard of CEDAW? Or you may have heard of it, but you actually don't know what is CEDAW. So we are all intelligent people, we know all what CEDAW is, right? So I will deliver on that basis, that we know what CEDAW is. So CEDAW, which is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, provides a comprehensive international framework in which violence against women is the manifestation of the historical unequal power relationship between women and men. Gender-based violence is defined as constituting discrimination against women and a human rights violation. It obligates states to prevent, investigate, prosecute, and punish such acts, and to provide remedies for victims. Closely linked to prevention is the requirement that states must provide adequate protection to victims, survivors, and potential victims of violence. Though you said you know CEDAW, I would just like to give a little bit of gist of what actually CEDAW is. So CEDAW is a convention that was that has been ratified so far by 189 member states. So when you ratify CEDAW, the state is obligated to implement CEDAW. I'm glad Taiwan has, in spite of the difficulties and challenges, obligated itself to implement CEDAW, which is very, very commendable. Because there are many countries which have ratified CEDAW, but who have reservations in several articles, and they do not actually fully implement CEDAW. CEDAW has a committee of 23 experts from around the world who are elected to this committee, and this every country has to report to the CEDAW committee every 4 years. CEDAW has 30 articles, but the most substantive articles are the 16 articles, under which the countries have to report to CEDAW what they have been implementing in the 4 years. Now the committee, I'm one of the CEDAW committee members. The committee is stated internationally as one of the most hardest working committee because it has to hear of so many countries. And let me tell you, I have been in 2 of the sessions now. I'm a new committee member since January, and I have been in 2 sessions. And let me tell you, nowadays, we particularly ask the countries, when they talk about violence against women, how many shelters do you have? How many, one shelter, how many population does it cover? Is it in an accessible area? Some say they have increased funding. We say increased funding does not tell us. What percentage of increased funding? What is your plan to increase shelters? You know, so the reason I'm mentioning this is shelter movement is getting visibility. And CEDAW committee particularly asks countries about these questions. So having said that, you more or less, even if you know of CEDAW, you more or less know how CEDAW works, because you directly have a constructive dialogue with countries asking them specific questions. And it is the only treaty that does that with countries. So for shelters movement, CEDAW is extremely important. So CEDAW has 16 substantive articles, and as per article, actually all articles deal more or less with discrimination against women. But Article 1 and 2 of CEDAW, according to that, states have human rights obligations to combat and prevent all forms of discrimination and violence against women by prohibiting and sanctioning sex gender-based discrimination in all its forms. To this end, states are to realize the principle of equality between men and women, Article 2, and to empower women, Article 3, by undertaking measures to ensure women's full development and advancement. CEDAW general recommendation. What is a general recommendation of CEDAW? CEDAW has 16 articles. This was derived in 1979. It was adopted in 1991. So since then, there are many changes already. So sometimes the articles may not interpret in detail what actually we are facing. So if that is the case, the CEDAW committee drafts a general recommendation detailing the interpretation of a certain article, saying what it means, its details. So CEDAW, General Recommendation 19, that was done a long time ago on violence against women, defines gender-based violence against women as violence that is directed against a woman because she is a woman, and it emphasizes the importance of shelters and specifies that states should establish support services for victims of family violence, rape, sexual assault, and other forms of gender-based violence, including shelters, specially trained health workers, rehabilitation, and counseling. So the General Recommendation 19 mentions shelters. And we are very happy to note, even the General Recommendation 19 has been of several years. And as we were working, we realized it does not interpret a whole range of violence against women issues. So just recently, in its July session, just recently in Geneva, we passed another general recommendation. That's the recently adopted General Recommendation 35, July 14, 2017, on gender-based violence against women, updating General Recommendation number 19, further specifies that state parties should provide accessible, affordable, and adequate services to protect women from gender-based violence, prevent its reoccurrence, and provide or ensure funding for reparation to all its victims and survivors. It recommends that states should provide specialized women support services, such as free of charge 24-hour helplines, and sufficient numbers of safe and adequately equipped crisis support and referral centers, as well as adequate shelters for women, their children, and other family members as required. This is important because now the CEDAW committee will ask questions based on this general recommendation. So shelters is mentioned so much in detail that our questions will be focused on this to the states. As part of reparation program, it also recommends that states allocate appropriate human and financial resources at national, regional, and local levels to effectively implement laws and policies for the prevention, protection, and victim survivor support, investigation, prosecution, and provision of reparations to victim survivors of all forms of gender-based violence against women, including support to women's organizations. Do you know, normally we say gender-based violence, GBV. But particularly in this recommendation, we are saying gender-based violence against women. Because when normally nowadays what is happening when you say gender-based violence, you only think, oh, but of course men, but of course women. But of course in percentage, I'm not saying men do not face violence. Men also face violence. But in comparison, it is the percentage of women which is significantly much higher than men who face violence. So even when we say gender-based violence, it is gender-based violence against women because you are facing violence and discrimination because you are a woman. That is why that's called gender-based violence against women. The recommendations include establishing and implementing appropriate multi-sectoral referral mechanisms to ensure effective access of women survivors to comprehensive services, ensuring full participation of and cooperation with non-governmental women's organizations. So the collaboration with NGOs is also mentioned in this general recommendation. Women and girls often find it difficult to access justice because of burdens of work for payment, lack of transport, and shouldering the burdens of childcare and taking care of the family and the home. We all know that. You might say, okay, we have a law on domestic violence, now everything will get settled. It won't, because many women do not know about it. Many women do not have the money to travel to the main station where her hearings will be heard. Many women do not have economic empowerment to be able to lead an independent life after they decide to leave a violent relationship. So even if you have laws, it's not going to get implemented. In General Recommendation 33, 2015 on women's access to justice, CEDAW recognizes the financial constraints faced by many women victims of violence and calls on states to guarantee access to financial aid, crisis centers, shelters, hotlines, and medical, psychosocial, and counseling services. It further requires states to take steps to guarantee that women are not subjected to undue delays in applications for protection orders, and that all cases of gender-based discrimination under criminal law, including violence, are heard in a timely and impartial manner. We know about delays. One case might take years to get, to be heard also. So it talks about these delays as well. So this is what in CEDAW. There are much more detailed things, but just to look at it, these are certain articles 1, 2, and 3, and also General Recommendation 19, the updated General Recommendation 35, the General Recommendation 33. These all have shelters specifically mentioned in these General Recommendations. Now, the reference to the shelters dates back to actually 1993. The 1993 Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women calls on states to ensure that women subjected to violence and, where appropriate, their children have specialized assistance such as rehabilitation, assistance with child care and maintenance, treatment, counseling, and health and social services, facilities and programs, as well as support structures, and to take all other appropriate measures to promote their safety and physical and psychological rehabilitation. It does not mention shelters, but it does mean shelters over here. Now in Beijing, in the Beijing Platform for Action 1995, states also affirmed their commitment to provide well-funded shelters and relief support for girls and women subjected to violence, as well as medical, psychological, and other counseling services, and free or low-cost legal aid. After that, the CSWs. How many of us know about CSWs or have attended CSWs? The full form is Commission on the Status of Women. It's a commission at New York, based in New York, which monitors the implementation of the 12 critical areas adopted by Beijing every year, focused on a particular theme. The theme next year is rural women and what they face. It's held usually in March. Every year in March, it's a 2-week session. And this is a very important global monitoring tool, because at the end of the meeting, they come up with agreed conclusions, which you take it back to your country and lobby and advocate with your country to implement those agreed conclusions. So that is why this is a very important global policy. So the Commission on the Status of Women's agreed conclusions on the elimination and prevention of all forms of violence against women and girls, adopted at its 57th session in 2013, call for multidisciplinary and gender-sensitive preventive and protective measures, such as emergency barring orders and protection orders, and for access to shelters in the context of the strengthening of multi-sectoral services, programs, and responses to violence against women. These include state and independent women's shelters and counseling centers, 24-hour helplines, social aid services, one-stop crisis centers, child services, and public housing services to provide easily accessible and safe assistance for women and children. Now this is another lobbying document that we can use. Now the most important and the most recent document is the Sustainable Development Goals, with goals which is called the SDGs in short, and I'm sure everyone has heard about it because it has been discussed so intensely at the UN level, global level, regional level, national level. And we are now at the implementation phase of the sustainable, in fact not the implementation, charting the indicators for the Sustainable Development Goals. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development includes 17 goals. I hope everyone knows that. And with a lot of advocacy and effort, we managed to have a separate goal 5 on gender equality and the empowerment of women. This goal has a target, it has 5 targets, but the target 5.2 of this goal is to eliminate all forms of violence against all women and girls in the public and private spheres, including trafficking and sexual and other types of exploitation. It is under this article that we feel shelters will be covered. However, there is a challenge because there are indicators under every target. And now, its related indicators, the target 2 and its related indicators, 5.2.1 and 5.2.2, do not address collection of data on shelters. So if you do not have indicators related to shelters, you will not have information at a national level on how many shelters there are, whether we need additional shelters or not. So what is required for us now is to lobby with your local government, with your regional meetings, international meetings. One of them could be, like, if you come up with a declaration from this conference, one of them could be that you should have a specific indicator under the Goal 5, Target 2, on collection of data on shelters. This is very important. And then only you will know the context of shelters. Then only the national government will say, oh, so many shelters, we need to get another shelters. You know? So this is extremely important that we need to lobby at the moment. And I don't know how much, I will not go into detail. How much time do I have? I will not go into detail about the regional frameworks because there are, I think, experts from other continents who might talk about it. But looking at regional frameworks, there is the Istanbul Convention, which covers Europe, which does talk about shelter. And then there is the Belém-do Pará, which is the Inter-American Convention on the Prevention, Punishment, and Eradication of Violence Against Women, which is the first, it was in 1994, which first regional instrument on violence against women. That also has reference to shelters. And the other is the African Charter on Human and People's Rights on the Rights of Women in Africa, also addresses violence against women, and Article 4.2 provides that state parties shall establish mechanisms and accessible services for effective information, rehabilitation, and reparation for victims of violence against women. So these three regional instruments, one is the Inter-American, one is the Istanbul one, and one is the African one. Now let me come back to, so I'm not going into details because we have other experts from the continent and you might want to talk about it later. Let's come to Asia. Now we have two mechanisms in Asia. One is the ASEAN. I think there are 10 or 12 countries in ASEAN from Central Asia and Southeast Asia. And the other is SARC, which is the South Asian Regional Cooperation, South Asian Regional Cooperation, right? South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, SARC. So we have these two mechanisms, right? But unfortunately, these two mechanisms are not very active, where particularly social cause and women's issues are concerned. However, I will read out what I have tried to derive from these mechanisms. I tried to look at it, no shelter mention. So I think we need to work here. So the ASEAN Committee on Women it has a special committee on women, has adopted the ACW Work Plan 2016-2020, which aims to advance women's rights and gender equality in ASEAN through regional cooperation. The plan highlights women's leadership, non-gender stereotyping, and social norm change and gender mainstreaming across the three pillars of ASEAN, which is elimination of violence against women, economic empowerment of women, and protection and empowerment of women in vulnerable situations. This could be related to shelters when we say vulnerable situations. That is what is mentioned in ASEAN. In Article 6 of SARC on promotion of the status of women states that all forms of discrimination and violence against women are offenses against human rights and dignity, and those offenses must be prohibited through legislative, administrative, and judicial actions. SARC has a gender policy advocacy group, it's called SARC GPAC, which has developed a draft action plan 2017-2019 to accelerate progress towards gender equality and women's empowerment within the SARC countries. I actually asked one of the members of GPAC, I'm doing this keynote at the Asian conference, I did not find a detailed action plan in the website, what is happening? And she said, we have only one meeting, I don't know when the next meeting is. So that is the state, and we don't know, we have not discussed much. So I think our regional frameworks, we are not utilizing much. It's not giving much attention to gender equality, violence against women, implementation of international human rights. So this is an area perhaps we, as an Asian network of shelters, that we should need to knock our doors on also. The global network of women, the global shelter movement, let me just give you a glimpse of the global shelter movement. The Global Network of Women Shelters was founded in 2009 after the first World Conference on Shelters held in Edmonton, Canada in 2008. We were around 800 who had gathered in Edmonton in Canada in 2008. At that time, it was just the first World Conference. But in 2009, a smaller group met and then we established the Global Network of Women Shelters. Its main purpose is to strengthen the shelter movement globally, regionally, and nationally, as well as increase awareness and strengthen advocacy for the formulation and effective implementation of laws and policies for ending violence against women and their children. GNW has so far organized 3 World Conferences. We are not sure yet where the last conference was in 2015 in Netherlands, and we have a host here, Rick J, who is in the board of GenderBased as well, and it was a wonderful conference, so well managed. But we are not sure yet where the 4th World Conference will be. We would love to have it in Asia, because Asia has never hosted a conference, And perhaps, I don't know, having a hope with all its leadership and resources and having the experience of organizing 3 regional conferences, perhaps is in a state or ready to hold a world conference. And I'm sure we would welcome it if the Garden of Hope took up that leadership, and we would be happy about it. The GNWS has published 5 global shelters data count reports, the last one containing information on 46 countries. It has been organizing side events and disseminating information during the CSW, is the Commission on the Status of Women meeting in New York, since 2010, but drawing global attention on support for shelters as well as influencing global policies. However, we have challenges. We do not have fund, we are not able to raise funds. Sustainability is a problem, reaching out to members is a problem, documentation is a problem. We are trying to strengthen that and find more resources so that we build a stronger movement in the years to come. Now, Asian shelters, I just want to give you a glimpse of, based on I've been a women's rights activist for almost 3 decades now, and based on my experience working also with shelters and women's violence against women in Nepal, in the region, and globally, I just want to give you and which you may agree, to a very brief picture of what Asian shelters is like. The types of shelters in Asia vary significantly across states, regions, and communities in Asia. In some states, there are no shelters. In others, there are only daily shelters. People come and then they go the next day. It's almost overnight, or it's only day. And that do not permit overnight stay. And some states have shelters run by civil society organizations, by NGOs, while others run state shelters. Some are government-run shelters, okay. And some are a combination of both, government and NGO together. In many states, the type of shelters is determined by the availability and amount of funding, either from the state or external donors, as well as on whether funding is sustainable. Funding is a huge issue. There are also solely state-operated shelters, but these generally fall short in their delivery of services. Government-run shelters are usually the people that are hired are because so it has access, influence, not because of the sensitivity. And the way it is operated is not very genuine. The lack or insufficient number of shelters as well as unavailability of shelters are issues of grave concern in most countries of Asia. Even where shelters are available, the service they provide is inadequate to respond to violence against women due to lack of financial resources. Many shelters do not have sustainable funding, and as a result, I'm going fast because my time is running out. And as a result, they are not able to develop, plan, or provide the required services. One of the major challenges faced by those who operate shelters is ensuring access to safe and affordable housing options and income-generating employments for women and children when they leave the shelter. Many women who have fled from domestic violence are forced to return to their homes and to face further violence due to the lack of second-stage shelter facilities. In some contexts, adolescents and boys above a specific age are excluded from shelters, separating them from their mothers or preventing mothers from seeking a shelter. The security of the building is another key issue for shelters, as the women and children in the shelter as well as the staff are occasionally threatened of violent attacks by perpetrators. Many shelters are run in rented houses. The tenants in most cases do not want to rent their houses to shelters or demand very high rental fee. Now these are challenges of Asian shelters. Most shelters generally provide support for at least 3 to 6 months with the possibility of extending the period of accommodation where necessary. The length of stay in emergency shelters is generally short, which may not offer women enough time to recuperate from the violence they have faced or to secure a space before leaving the shelter. Many shelters, due to limited resources, provide only safety
and some services related to physical well-being. They are not able to take in victims who require special services related to mental health, psychosocial, and counseling to support access to justice and legal services. You might be wondering this is what it is. Social stigma and pressure to keep families together, as well as women's lack of economic empowerment, compel many women to reconcile with those who have inflicted violence against them. Law enforcement also tends to minimize domestic violence and consider it a private matter, discouraging victims from pursuing cases. Many mediation and negotiations are done by those who do not have adequate knowledge of its process and impact on the victim. Negotiations take place, but they don't know what a negotiator is, what a mediator is. So some suggestions for strengthening shelter movement in Asia, it could also be globally actually. Using international human rights instruments, let me go through it, and CEDAW, I think is the most important one. What you could do is, I have picked up only a few. Someone could do a good study, it could be the Asian network, feeding into the global network. I have also talked to our global network secretariat that we should have it. When in CEDAW, everyone now looks at me when shelter comes and tells me we need data for shelters. How many shelters are there in Asia? In which country, how many shelters? And I don't have the answer. So I realize UN and instruments need that kind of data so that we can advocate more for saying, see, Taiwan has so much population, but it has only 5 shelters in so many states. So, I'm hypothetically saying, so in that case, you need more shelters so we can question the country. This is just a hypothetical. Of course, Taiwan is not reporting to CEDAW, but this is what we can do. So data plays a very important part. So maybe Asian Network of Women Shelter could start a fact sheet saying which are the UN documents that refers to shelters and what does it say? What does it say? And then you could have another fact sheet. What does CEDAW? CEDAW committee, these are some sample questions that CEDAW committee can ask on shelters to different countries. So that will help the CEDAW committee as well. So this is one suggestion that I have in terms of using CEDAW. And of course, whenever, let's say from Asia, let's say India is reporting to CEDAW. If India is a member of Asian Network of Women Shelters, you should already be talking to the people who are attending CEDAW, the NGOs, and you should have a fact sheet prepared for the CEDAW committee members on what questions you would want to be asked by the CEDAW committee members. So this is how you strengthen the shelter movement, by using international instruments, particularly CEDAW. I've covered number 2 also. Number 3, strengthen advocacy for the adoption of domestic violence law in countries that do not have the laws and to enforce implementation where they have. Perhaps a comparative study can be conducted including best practices from such countries that have such laws would be beneficial to promote such advocacy. Initiate dialogue with regional forums such as ASEAN and SAARC, which I have already said. And then a basic standardization of shelters. What is it that Asian Network of Women Shelters should have a standard policy in operating and managing shelters so that you have a pick-off. Does a shelter have this? Maybe that could also be helpful for countries who are, or organizations who are wanting to open up new shelters. And continue to promote cross-learning and capacity-building programs for those operating shelters, which you are already doing. And in conclusion, what I say is shelter work requires courage, compassion, and selflessness, which I believe each one of you, since you are attending a shelter conference, have it. Without having that passion and commitment, you wouldn't be here. It is the Asian Network of Women Shelters that has recognized this and brought us together. We must move forward and work together with this collective strength to respond to the cries of women and children who have suffered violence and help them regain lives of happiness and independence. I wish the conference all success. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Rosa, for that very insightful presentation. Now it's time for a very short break. To save time, we'll have 10 minutes break. Please come back at 10:28. Thank you. 我们现在有10分钟的休息，因为要节省时间，所以请大家10点28分回来。谢谢。